pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to e3, knight to f6, knight to f3, pawn to e6, pawn to c4, pawn to a6, knight to c3, pawn to c4, bishop to c4, pawn to c5, pawn to c5, bishop to c5, queen to d8, king to d8, bishop to d3, king to e7, king to a1, knight to c6, knight to g5, rook to d8, knight to e4, knight to e4, knight to e4, bishop to b6, bishop to c3, pawn to f6, pawn to g4, bishop to a5, bishop to a5, knight to a5, bishop to c2, bishop to c6, rook to g1, knight to c4, rook to d8, rook to d8, pawn to g5, pawn to f5, knight to c3, knight to e5, pawn to f4, knight to f3, rook to g2, pawn to g6, rook to f2, pawn to e5, pawn to e4, pawn to e4, knight to e4, knight to d4, knight to g3, knight to c2, king to c2, rook to f8, knight to e2, king to e6, king to d2, bishop to b5, rook to f3, rook to f7, rook to e3, bishop to e2, rook to e5, king to d6, rook to e2, rook to f4, king to e3, rook to g4, rook to d2, king to e6, rook to c2, rook to g5, rook to c7, rook to b5, rook to h7, rook to b2, pawn to a4, pawn to a5, pawn to h4, rook to b4, rook to h6, king to f7, pawn to h5, pawn to h5, rook to h5, pawn to b6, rook to e5, king to f6, rook to e4, rook to b3, king to d2, king to f5, rook to h4, king to e5, king to c2, rook to f3, rook to h6, rook to f6, rook to f6, king to f6, king to d3, king to e5, king to e3, king to d6, king to d4, king to c6, king to c4, pawn to b5,